Hi there, everyone. So I wanted to tell my story, a little bit my life story in a nutshell, in order to give people an idea of how I came to the birthing of Revolutionary Being, which is pretty much my soul mission, our life's work. And I'm going to tell it a little bit through the lens of some key concepts using terminology from Carl Jung's work, as well as Joseph Campbell's work, and sort of woven through the yogic terminology in order to describe what actually happened to me on a psychospiritual level within my story. And the reason I'm telling my story through these lenses is because I'm hoping to inform others as to how to invoke or induce a similar transformational process. Because my life story has been one long sort of alchemical process that's led me on a path of individuation and awakening. And everything from the good, the bad, and the ugly from my childhood till now has been a part of that. And so I want to tell that story in a way that gives others a sort of a map, maybe, in order to follow a similar path for themselves. So I use the terms a lot in my writing and in the ways that I describe this stuff. I use the terms conscious, unconscious, and collective unconscious, and even sometimes superconscious mind. And these terms, for me, came largely through Carl Jung's work, which I was introduced to at a pretty young age. But it also just came through my own internal explorations of sort of how awakening happens and how individuation, which is also a term from Carl Jung, happens. So awakening or individuation, they're really the same concepts as what the yogis call self-realization, and what I often call self-liberation. So from my experience, this collective unconscious mind is also where the astral dimensions are, which we'll kind of talk about some as we go. So in Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell's work, as well as in yoga, we speak of this dormant, latent potential that exists within the human individual. And in psychological terms, this latent potential is located in this unconscious mind. In yoga, it is an energy located at the base of the spine. So this is the concept of the Kundalini, right? So in yoga, the Kundalini is this latent, dormant potential energy coiled up at the base of the spine. And the awakening of the Kundalini actually awakens the unconscious mind. So these are just two different mechanisms to describe the same process. And but you can kind of think of it as Western versus Eastern. In the West, we talk about mind and the mental stuff and all that. In the East, it's explained much more from an energetic perspective. And so in yoga, the human is an energetic being first. And it's this energy that actually animates the brain and the spinal cord, which then creates the human, right? Creates the consciousness or the perception of the human. So in yoga, or within this terminology, it's like consciousness and energy are kind of interchangeable terms. So when you talk about mind in the East, there's like a lot of different ways to interpret mind. Okay, so in yoga, or in my awakenings through yoga, I've found that the human is actually a toroidal field. So each chakra, which is So we're this toroidal field, and we have a lot of different energy centers, right? I think there's something like in yoga, I think there's something like, I don't know if it's 150 or 400. It's something crazy like that. But the main ones are what we think of as the chakras, right? So 7 main energy centers, or sometimes 12 main energy centers up the central channel, which is the Sushumna, the central channel. And each of these energy centers overlays usually nerve plexuses or the endocrine system, certain glands. So you have your energetic anatomy that overlaps or overlays your physical anatomy, your subtle anatomy and your physical anatomy. There's an interface there. So let's see. So these energy centers actually contain programmed signals, right? Based on our chosen habitual pathways over lifetimes. So in our subtle anatomy, we have programs running in each chakra, right? Each energy center. And we've put those programs there. We put those programs there by choosing the same, even when you think of it in terms of physical anatomy, by choosing the same neuronal pathways over and over and over again, right? But when we choose those same neuronal pathways and create those same perceptions over and over again, this is where you get karma. So your karma becomes encoded and compounded into your subtle energy system through choosing your perception. So in this way, your brain and your nervous system, your physical anatomy, is in conjunction with the subtle anatomy to create your reality and create your karma over time. So this is how, with the karma, you're born from life to life with this kind of same imprinting, because it's in your subtle anatomy, right? And your subtle anatomy goes with you from lifetime to lifetime, at least the subtlest part of your anatomy. There's certain layers that get burned off and reformed and stuff, but that's for another conversation. So what's happening is we're in a constant flux with this inner and outer energy system. So you're this toroidal field, okay? You have your central channel, which creates a field around you, which is in constant flux. It's interconnected with the greater field. Okay, so in yogic terms, this is all energy, but this energy is also consciousness. So at its most base level, that greater field, the super conscious mind, is what we call it in Western psychology through Carl Jung. That super conscious mind is what we call like source in energetic terms, or sort of new age yogic terms, right? And that source is a form of consciousness, but it's pure consciousness. Okay, so as that energy comes into our system, through the crown, through the root, through the chakras, because each chakra center is a portal of its own with a toroidal field. So we're not just one toroidal field. We have this constantly moving influx energy, very complex energy system with a lot of little portals. And then we're one big portal with that central channel. So basically, like I said, at the base level, this energy is just pure consciousness or pure energy. This is what we call the Brahman, right? This is what the ancient Hindus call the Brahman, right? That's the Godhead. That's the pure source energy. That's before it becomes encoded, right? How does it become encoded? It becomes coded or encoded by how we choose to interact with it. So the interface where we interact with it is within our own body, at that gate between the subtle anatomy and the nervous system, spinal cord, brain, all our other systems. So you can see this now in quantum physics. They have this experiment. It's called the double slit experiment, right? Where energy comes as a wave, not a particle. It comes as a wave of possibility. until consciousness is added. So once you start to observe it or witness it, it starts to compress into a particle. And I hope I'm not butchering this, but this is what I'm talking about. So we have this encoding that we've imposed onto this pure energy within our systems, right? And there's different codes in each chakra, in each energy portal. So anyway, I don't know how much more deeply I want to go into this, but so for example, the second chakra generally has our emotional programming, and the second chakra actually connects us into the lower astral dimensions, right? So if you start to enter the lower astral dimensions or peer into the lower astral dimensions through your second chakra, through your unconscious repressed emotional material, you will see that material directly manifest on that plane. So you will see, literally like your demons, right? And these entities or these beings on one level actually do exist. They have their own consciousness in a way, but they're also just a direct manifestation or product of your repressed emotional self. So it's actually can be a little bit dangerous to start exploring those realms before you've become a certain amount of conscious, because it can be difficult to work with that material, on that plane like that. So your third eye is actually a window into these astral dimensions, right? So this chakra is actually your window into the greater astral dimensions, into the collective unconscious mind, into the greater field. So you can actually read the signals that are contained in your chakras that are contained in the layers of your greater field through this visionary portal. So as the Kundalini raises up through your central channel, it awakens you to the information encoded in these different energy centers, all the way to the visionary portal. If you can raise it up, or if it raises up all the way, you're going to reach the Brahman, right? Like you're going to open out through the crown, and your consciousness is going to expand into the pure totality of existence, which is that Brahman, which is the Godhead, which is pure source energy. So that is the same thing as awakening the unconscious mind that we talk about in psychological terms. So I'm sort of trying to bridge the gap between our energetic anatomy and our psychology, and how we can work with that interface. So in yoga, you can get directly to the interface between your subtle anatomy and your psychology before it even gets to your psychology. So you can actually get into the interface of how your subtle anatomy is being interpreted through your nervous system. And you can stop interpreting it through the habitual pathways of the nervous system. And when you do that, that energy frees up and moves, and it changes. So this is what trauma is. Trauma is the nervous system is responding to a certain subtle energy in a way that's sort of frazzling or frying or getting caught, right? So once you get to a certain point in yoga, you can meet that energy directly. And then this is like not even about changing beliefs or emotions, or it's before all that. It's subtler than that. So the visions, moving right along, the visions that come through this third eye portal, they are symbolic, archetypal content of the unconscious mind. So I didn't talk about archetypes, but along with Carl Jung's work, the unconscious, the conscious, and superconscious and all that, he talks about archetypes, right? And so these archetypes, like the dakinis in yoga, the ancestors that the certain traditions speak of, and including some of these entities and intelligences that you see on DMT, they're contained in this collective unconscious psyche or mind space, right? Which are also like our coding in our chakras is plugged into that greater mind and interacting and co-creating that greater mandala. And so within that are these archetypes, which are these sort of greater organized intelligences in a way, but we're a part of them. We co-create them. So this is part of what's happening during a DMT release. And the reason I'm kind of explaining it also through the lens of DMT is because my greatest awakening, which I'll get to, was actually it was a visionary experience. It was a Kundalini awakening. It was a journey from unconscious to conscious, or a journey into the depths of the unconscious mind. And it was a sort of DMT release. It was very similar to a DMT journey. So like I said, these archetypes are the expressions of the structures of the human psyche. And lately I've been playing with the idea of these ancestors as archetypal intelligence that are infused into the collective psyche. So they also correspond, and this goes along with the idea of the dakinis in the Tibetan tradition. They correspond to a type of morphogenic field frequency. So again, here we're trying to traverse the correlation between mind and energy and field. Energy, consciousness, greater field, mind, unconscious, mind, greater mind, right? So our ancestors, or these archetypes, or these greater intelligences, or these dakinis, sort of are infused through a morphogenic field frequency as well. So part of the reason I'm talking about this is because the path that I went on in this life and the adventure that I followed that led to my awakening is accessible to all of us because it exists in this, it's that path and that intelligence and that creative impulse is in the collective mind space already. And there are mythologies across the globe that speak to this, right? And in our current time, we've lost touch with those mythologies. We've sort of dismissed them as fantasy or not real. And the truth is they are very real. They are symbols and stories of these aspects of the greater mind that we can all access and find validation and support and momentum in. So that's why I'm kind of weaving it through this and sharing this. So through the lens of Joseph Campbell's work, we have the idea of the call to adventure and the hero's journey. So you can kind of study this in his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, where he takes mythologies from all over the globe, from all over history, and draws correlations. And he's come up with this theme of the hero's journey. And the hero's journey speaks to a sort of universal human process of transformation. It speaks to the human condition on a universal level. It speaks to our need for some kind of initiation or process for psychological maturation. It speaks to our journey into the depths of the unconscious, not only in order to individuate for ourselves, but to access this latent potential, this greater mind space, this greater mind space. And so the idea was also explored by Carl Jung that certain symbologies and archetypes, certain myths show up through many traditions because they are an expression of the collective unconscious mind. So, and I would expand on that. They're expressions of the astral realms. So the function of the hero's journey, or the function of this myth, is to assist the process of psychological maturation and development. And we're really missing that in our culture these days. And so I feel really called to tell my story in a way that transmits this transformational process and gives others inspiration and guidance for themselves. So the function is to assist the process of psychological maturation and development by making the unconscious conscious and bringing one on a journey of individuation, self-realization, or self-liberation for the individual. So I'm hoping I'm going to be able to kind of illustrate this pathway through the telling of my own story and through the sharing of this mythology, and that I can really nail home to people that there's a lot of support and validation already accessible from within your own mind, from within your own energy system, from within your own psyche, to bust out of your current frame and bust out of the limiting frames of where you might find yourself right now. So as far as following the call to adventure, this is one of the choice points I really try to encourage in others. And so to firstly listen to the call, to hear it. It can be difficult to hear. It starts as a faint whisper, right? So the call is something that comes from your heart, but it is not your human heart per se, right? It's your heart of hearts. It's your inner heart. It's your heart portal. Okay, so your heart portal connects you into your soul body. And you could have planted seeds there that you don't remember from here, that you don't remember from this lifetime, right? There's seeds that come from before this lifetime. There's seeds that you planted when you were still a seed in the astral planes. Before you were coming into birth here, you set intentions. You were part of that collective mind and you were imagining up a story. Okay, so that call comes from there, but it comes through here. It comes through this portal. So that's the first and foremost thing. You got to listen for that call. And that call can show up in a lot of different ways. And I'll share with you how that call showed up for me in a little bit. So not acting on this call can really lead to depression and anxiety for people. So you start to get this heaviness of the false self. And I think this is a lot of what's going on in our current society. People have so much anxiety. People have so much depression because they're living in life and they're telling a story that isn't theirs yet, right? There's more. There's more to the story. There's more to your story and you know it. Okay. And if you're trying to live a life where you're not following that call and you're not following your creative impulse and you're not following your own adventure, eventually that's going to weigh down on you. So I think a lot of depression and anxiety comes from just that, trying to fit yourself into a society or culture that isn't really big enough for who you really are. Trying to fit yourself into a frame that isn't big enough for who you really are. So anyway, there are many types of initiation like this known throughout history and myth that we've lost in our current times. And I think this is one of the missing links, like I just said, in our culture and society that's adding to the chaos. So in Jung and Campbell's work and in the yogic tradition, like I said, they talk about this latent, dormant potential hidden within the unconscious mind. So in yoga, it's the Kundalini. It's the energy at the base of the spine that's sort of hidden from us or coiled up or out of reach. You haven't accessed it yet. In psychology, it's this latent potential is hidden within the unconscious mind. And like I said, the Kundalini Awakening is the process of making the unconscious mind conscious. It's just explaining it in terms of energy and consciousness versus mind. So the call to adventure And the following of the call to adventure is an initiatory journey to access this potential and bring it back. So it can be an outer adventure into foreign lands, but it can also be an inner adventure into the unexplored unconscious self. And it's often both. It's often some kind of outer adventure, and the inner adventure is the most important. So you can see this type of experience created by the vision quest and the Native American practices. And that's where you see the fasting and the sense deprivation as a catalyst for a sort of ego death. And ego death is also deeply parallel or a catalyst for this DMT release. So, or for the acquiring of a guiding vision. So in the vision questing, you find them pushing themselves to the brink through fasting, through sense deprivation, and also obviously through prayer and intention to acquire a guide or a guiding vision for their life. And so you see this in the idea of going into the sweat lodge and going through a sort of death and coming out reborn. And you see that sort of going deep into the cave or the darkness or the deep ocean throughout a lot of different mythologies. So that's a representation of deep diving into your own unconscious self and coming out the other side reborn. So, and they call DMT the little death, right? They call it the little death because wait, do they call, is that, I think that's something that people say. Because you will go through an ego death when you take that substance, and there's a disclaimer later about all this, but so anyway, moving right along. So in my story, I had a pretty tumultuous upbringing. There was emotional abuse, there was physical abuse, there was a lot of unpredictability, and I'm not saying anything, and I'm never sharing my story to throw my family under the bus. That's not my intention. My intention is always to inspire others to go through their own healing process and become empowered through their experiences. So I have to talk about some of the nitty-gritty of my experiences in order to do that. So within my childhood, there was, like I said, a lot of turmoil. There were a lot of narcissists around. There was emotional and physical abuse. There was a lot of poverty, a lot of fear of not surviving for myself. And of course, in order to survive that, I pushed all that into my unconscious mind. I repressed all that. So up until the point when I really woke up, or the months before I really woke up, I really wasn't aware of my own kind of unconscious conditioning or my trauma. I had told myself a really convenient story about it. And I only really experienced my unconscious self or my trauma through projection off of others, which is largely what the whole world, many people do. We kind of experience it as pain that somebody else has inflicted versus a creation of our own, coming from our own unconscious mind. So for me, I started feeling this inner call that I was talking about from a very young age. And I would say probably about 11, 12 years old, I started really, I felt before that, I always felt like there was more and there was something off and there was something missing, but I really started feeling the desire to explore other religions and philosophies and traditions. And I didn't have a lot of access to that, but my mom actually had a few books on her bookshelf. And, funnily enough, Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung and some of the Native American stuff and the sort of pagan, like nature-based stuff. She had some of that stuff, but that I could dabble in a little bit. And all these years later, I can see how what these people were saying turned out to be so true for me, through my own experience. So that's kind of one of those synchronicities in life that's like, oh, cool. Like, don't ignore that, you know. At least I had that little bit to dabble into. But it wasn't a lot. It was just enough to give me like, okay, there's something else out there. There's some other way. There's some other path than this Catholic Christian path that I was introduced to. There's some other path than what's kind of being shown all around me. So my second call that I felt really deeply was the call to explore psychedelics. And just a little disclaimer or point of caution. It's really important not to screw around with psychedelics. I started feeling that call at a really young age, probably 13, 14 years old, but I don't recommend that for young people that young. And I'm going to talk about it honestly, because I feel like that's important. But I would recommend being at least 18 years of age and having obviously intention and motive straight, proper set and setting, and conscious, trustworthy facilitation. So you need to be working with somebody who's experienced. You need to have you need to have a safe setting, yada, yada, yada. So I first experimented with LSD at the age of 16, which is, like I said, really young, and I wouldn't recommend that for others. But for me, it was right. It worked out. I had proper set and setting. Well, some of the time I was pretty reckless, actually. I wouldn't recommend that for others, but the part of the problem with our current culture is that we don't have somewhere to go to have these experiences in a safe environment. And so what young people end up doing is just doing it themselves. And that's what I did. No one was going to tell me I couldn't do it. I knew from within my heart that psychedelics were going to give me something that wasn't accessible otherwise at the time. So anyway, so two things that psychedelics did for me is really started allowing me to see more deeply into the subconscious layers of my mind. So I started getting those initial experiences of, oh, wow, there's a lot more to me. There's a lot more to my mind than my conscious mind or what I am using from day to day and who I think I am. And a lot of that was really uncomfortable, especially at first, when you first start looking into your shadow. It's like, whoa, holy shit. Not who I thought I was, or I'm more insecure than I thought I was, or whatever. So that was an important juncture. And then one of the main things I saw, and what was pretty much the most important, was this feeling this interconnected nature of the earth and the cosmos, and feeling my part in that. So I really got that from psilocybin and LSD the first few times I felt that. So one of the experiences in which I began to truly understand that and understand the non-local nature of consciousness, right, was, and understand the ability to merge my consciousness with other types of consciousness, and to feel this interconnected nature of all things through this underlying conscious layer, this underlying energy, was in this huge lightning storm I got caught in this huge lightning storm on like 5 hits of LSD, on top of Harney Peak. Harney Peak, South Dakota is, I think it's the highest point between like the Appalachian Mountains and the Rocky Mountains or something like that. Highest point west of the, anyway, it's pretty high up there. It's a long hike. It's just these huge granite spires. It's incredibly beautiful. And we sat up there, we hiked up there at sunrise after taking our doses, and we watched this storm build from all over around. You could see 360 degrees. We watched every cloud from every stretch of the sky come together and meet in this gigantic storm, and we could see it coming toward us. It really you felt like you were touching the eternal just within that, because the power of that storm. Our hair was standing up, and I was actually deeply terrified. I thought, holy shit, like we're going to get struck by lightning. It's going to wash us off the side of this cliff face that we're sitting up on. You know, there's going to be a flash flood or whatever. I definitely was facing a lot of like fears of death. And well, anyway, so we hiked down a little ways, and we got into this, under this shelf, just down far enough where like we're under this rock shelf. So we're a little bit out of the rain, but there's still like water rushing down in front of us. And it was quite scary and enlivening too, because you're like, wow, you're kind of closer to death than you usually are. I mean, at least that was my experience. And there was a certain point where my consciousness merged with the consciousness of the storm. And I felt what it felt like to be that storm. And I don't even know how to describe it other than that. It was so incredible and so beautiful. And it was one of those first moments that I realized that consciousness is not in here. My consciousness is not in my head, right? So one thing that's really cool about that story, the fact that it was up on Harney Peak, is that Black Elk Speaks, you know, the South Dakota in that area is really sacred to the natives. And they called that the heart of the world, I think. And Black Elk Speaks had a vision where he called Harney Peak the Central Mountain. And I just think that's really special that I had that first, you know, when I was a teenager, that first experience of merging consciousness with Gaia, with this storm. And anyway, so the third call that I felt, and one of the most powerful calls, they're kind of getting more powerful as we go, was the call to do yoga and meditation. So I started practicing yoga at 17, I think I was almost 18, and meditation every day. And after like the first 28-day stretch, a lot of big changes started to happen. Like I really started to transform. And this is the thing about yoga, is like just the basic practice of asana. It really forces your brain to like parts of your brain to interact in ways it didn't before, because you're in all these weird postures and you're having to stay present enough to, you know, your right arm's different than your left arm. And so you're forcing this communication across different parts of the brain, especially if you mix that with breath work and affirmation. Then you're really getting into like, you're actually starting to reprogram the brain without even having to deal with your current beliefs, right? Your beliefs and everything is contained in your body anyway. So when you bring your mind into the present moment and you do these postures and you do these contorted postures, or you do, like I said, one side of the body is doing something different than the other and all that, you're actually starting to reprogram the neural networks throughout your body mind. So just asana by itself is really powerful, can be really powerful. So, and of course, in terms of trauma healing, keeping your breath steady while you're doing the asana calms the nervous system, yada, yada, yada. I don't really want to go too deeply into that here, but I wanted to mention it. So, and the idea of objectivity and equanimity, right? That starts to reprogram things, because you're not in your habitual pathways anymore. That hour, that 2 hours that you're doing yoga, you're not in your habitual pathways. So you're creating new pathways. And those new pathways eventually are going to lead to awakening if you keep putting that momentum into that. So anyway, within that first 28 days, I had a lot of really intense changes. And one of the most intense changes was that I quit drinking. And I didn't drink for the next 10 years. I might have had like a half a glass of wine a couple times or something out dancing, but I didn't. Drinking had been such a huge part of my life before that. I was such a partier. Like I had a rough childhood. I had my teenage years were reckless. I was self-destructive. And part of that was the drinking and the partying. And when I started doing yoga, within 28 days, boom, I wasn't interested in drinking anymore. Anything that interfered with my practice, once I saw what it was doing for me, I had to quit. And so drinking was one of those things. So not long after that, I got extremely fed up with my current frame of things. My town, the people I was hanging out with, everybody was drinking, everybody was partying. It just wasn't a reflection anymore of who I was becoming. And so the fourth call was the most powerful call, and that was the call to travel.